for it, ride for it. I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, ride for it. I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
All right. Thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land Solidarity podcast. I am really excited today and honored to be joined by Professor August Nimtz. We're talking to a professor of political science and African American and African studies and distinguished teaching professor at the University of Minnesota, Mr. August Nimtz. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Jake. It's a real honor to be a part of the program, given the history of the podcast and the kind of political work, grassroots political work that you've been involved in.
Thank you. And we're really excited to learn today. I was going to say in preparation for the show, I read like a turtleroad.org piece about your development, and it was just really fascinating. So I'm hoping at the end of the show, I can ask you a question about Thelonious Monk.
The monk.
Yes. But before that, I want to just jump right into the subject matter. So today we're talking primarily about your book, The Ballot, The Streets Are Both, From Marx and Engles to Lenin in the October Revolution. And I came to this book this summer in the context of the 2021 municipal elections in Minneapolis. In 2021, the entire city government is up for re-election. The mayor, the city council, the park board, the board of estimates and taxation. And these are consequential elections. There's a ballot measure that could restructure the way MPD fits into the city charter, into the city government. And that ballot measure is on the ballot. That amendment is on the ballot because we're in the wake of one of the most significant uprisings in recent American history that was really centered here in the city of Minneapolis, unprecedented working class mobilization or revolt that really put pressure on the system. There's also a rent control ballot measure this year in Minneapolis. There's a hotly contested mayoral race. There's also 4 DSA endorsed candidates, which was not the case in 2017. 3 of which have dual endorsements with the DFL. One who, uses the slogan independent working class political action and did not seek that dual endorsement. So I was coming to this election season really hoping to get grounded and clear on if I should and how I should engage with the electoral arena. It's been very intense struggles. I was involved in 2017 more so than I ever had been in my life before. And it was really through a nonpartisan organizing effort that was connected to a nonprofit. And we held candidate forums for the park board. We focused on the park board and we did some really good organizing, but we were constrained by our 501c3 status. And I told myself I would never do that again, And so I was doing research and I came across your book and actual history of how communists have taken the electoral arena seriously. So I've been reading this book this summer and just found it really enlightening and a great perspective for trying to figure out if I should pay attention, if we should pay attention, and if so, what is a powerful way to engage. So I want to say thank you for allowing me to set that context and kind of bring listeners to this conversation as well. So I'm just going to ask the first question then. Actually, I just realized what I should do is ask you, how did you get interested in writing this book? What was your reason for writing this? What was the motivation?
That's a good question. Let me just say, to be upfront, because some people know me and know my history and so on, and I've never voted for a bourgeois politician in my life. I tried once in 1964, but they wouldn't let me because of my skin color. And so by the time I was able to vote in 1972, I was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. And I've always voted for Socialist Workers' Party candidates ever since. And one of them is running for mayor in Minneapolis. That's Doug Nelson. The other one is for the City Council Ward 12 That's David Rosenfeld. So I just want to lay that out because people who know me know my politics and my history. So I need to be transparent about that.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. The book, in many ways, was a product of the Great Recession of 2008 and the political response to the Great Recession, namely the Occupy movement. And for a number of years, I wanted to do a book on Lenin. I had promised my readers in my Marx Engles 2000 book, I promised my readers I would get around to Lenin, that is to look at whatever happened to the Marx Engles project after they were gone. And I promised readers I would do something on Lenin. So in many ways, this book is my down payment, my promise to my readers. But I didn't want to do some major book about Lenin in his entirety. And I was trying to figure out what angle. And so when Occupy and also the Arab Spring, the events in Tunisia and in Egypt, motivated me to focus on the question of Lenin's electoral perspective. And because, as you may remember, there was a big debate amongst the Occupy participants about whether or not should we participate in the political process and elections. And by the way, this is an old debate. I'm working on a new book project with a colleague, Kyle Edwards, and we are comparing Marx with Frederick Douglass. And one of the things that we've learned is that this debate about whether or not to participate in elections goes way back. The abolitionist movement here in the United States, that was a big debate within the abolitionists. Should they get involved in the electoral process? And Douglas agrees with abstention, and not unlike anarchists would decades later. But Douglas breaks with that perspective and sees the need to involve himself in electoral politics. So in the middle of the 19th century, as the vote becomes more available for men, that becomes a discussion amongst working class activists. Should progressive forces, should working class parties be involved at all in the electoral process? Okay, fast forward to 2011, 2012, the Occupy movement, that issue resurfaces. And because of previous work I had done and what I knew about Lenin, I decided, maybe this is the hook. This is the angle I want to come into this discussion, because there were those who argued that involvement in the electoral process was a no-go. It was futile. It was a betrayal of the mass movement. And I knew better. Lenin had to deal with that issue. Marx and Engles had to deal with that issue. So that was the reason. That's the motivation. It was behind the book. The book is a conscious intervention. Yes. It's a conscious intervention into that debate that was going on in that moment.
And that's why I so much appreciate it, because, I was coming to political age around the Occupy movement. I participated in the Occupy movement, and so it was really heartening for me to realize that I saw that dynamic so many times in the book, that a lot of the movement debates and a lot of the issues are things that people have dealt with before. And I think it's a product of our the political censorship and that we don't really engage in that history, So this was like a great history for me, and like really great to know comrades have wrestled with these dynamics for so long.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. The book was intended just for activists like yourself who are grappling with that question. So it joys. I'm pleased to no end to hear what you're saying.
That's awesome. It's really incredible. So let's start with then, you make the case that Lenin's electoral strategy was firmly rooted in the experience and the teachings of Marx and Engles, who you call the founders of the modern communist movement. And you talk about how a lot of their political formulations and what they built their approach to the electoral arena were lessons that they drew from the European Spring in 1948. Could you just
1848,
1848,
right.
excuse me.
Sure.
Could you talk to us about that? What was the European Spring?
Yeah.
You know, I know that's a big story, but if you can give people just a sense of it.
No.
And what?
Don't apologize at all. We don't do enough of this in the classroom. And so yes, the European Spring was really the revival of the French Revolution. You remember 1789, the French Revolution, the big one. And that revolution was overthrown. It was overthrown in 1794. Napoleon, of course, hijacked it, and the end of that experiment, that major experiment in representative democracy, came to an end. That was what the French Revolution was. It did get rid of the monarchy. It really downsized significantly the monarchy. But as is oftentimes in history, revolutions are followed by counter-revolutions. And the counter-revolution came about by 1794, 1796. Napoleon was the most visible representative of that counter-revolution. And so the European Spring in 1848 was a revival of the democratic movement to finally get rid of monarchy, kings and queens, get rid of them, and to reestablish a republic. And so coming out of the masses going to the streets in February of 1848 in Paris, that's the beginning of it. And it reverberates throughout Europe. There were more than 50 major uprisings that had taken place in Europe, and including in the Americas, in Latin America, in Brazil. There was an echo of the 1840. And one of the things that this new research project that I'm involved in reveals, that here in the United States, it had reverberations, especially for someone like Frederick Douglass, but for the women's movement. The women's movement, Seneca Falls in 1848, was in many ways an echo of what happened in Europe and the European Spring. So yes, it was an attempt to finally get rid of the monarchs and to establish liberal republican democracy. That's what the European Spring was. So that's the brief answer to your question. And in that context, the question of elections, because if it's going to be representative democracy, elections are opposed. And so with the new government that comes into existence in February of 1848, they are forced to revive a promise from the first French Revolution. In the first French Revolution, universal male suffrage was promised, but it never happened. It never happened in the first one. All right, so when the second revolution happens in February 1848, that's one of the promises that the government makes, that they will reinstitute universal male suffrage. And so for the first time in history, in any major society, certainly, in any major class society, the first time in history, elections based upon universal male suffrage take place in April of 1848, April and May, those elections at the end of April and beginning of May in 1848. Those are the first elections. And it's always important for those of us in the United States, sometimes we erroneously think that universal male suffrage took place here in the United States before, but that's not true. And if you think about it, you didn't have universal male suffrage in the United States until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Right. More than 100 years later.
Yes. So that's where the question of elections gets posed again, because elections are real. So you
Right.
got universal mail suffrage. So the question is, do you participate in these elections or not? How do you participate in them or not? That becomes the issue for the working class.
Yes, and what I'm realizing is at that time you had people like Marx and Engels who were active participants in these movements and who recognized that they won universal male suffrage, but they wanted more than universal male suffrage. At that time, they were already cognizant of the limits of universal male suffrage and they wanted more liberation. And especially if you think about Marx and Engels and socialists, people who already had a revolutionary consciousness, again, so this debate is being forged in that moment. People who have a revolutionary consciousness, do we participate and how do we participate? So from there, what really were Marx and Engels advocating for? How should a socialist purport themselves in these new parliamentary institutions?
Yeah, there's an important document they wrote in March of 1850 called the Address of the Central Authority of the Communist League. And in many ways, it's a self-criticism. It's a self-critique. It's only 11 pages. It's a great document. And it criticizes the party that Marx was the leader of for having suspended its operations and dissolved itself into the broader democratic movement. And one of the problems of doing that was that when elections took place, the regime was forced to grant elections, but the working class movement didn't have its own representatives. It depended upon the petty bourgeois Democrats. And then they realized that they got sold out. They got sold out by the petty bourgeois Democrats. So the address, the March 1850 address, is self-criticism for having dissolved the party called the Communist League into the broader democratic movement. And the document says, okay, we assume there's going to be an upsurge again. And then we have to figure out how do we respond to that upsurge. And one of the lessons from the past, from the last year and a half, is that the working class needs to have its own candidates in elections. And it needs to use its elections for two things. And run candidates for recognizing that even if you don't have any chance of winning, even if you have no chance of winning, it's important that the working class have its own candidates because one, it's an opportunity to educate, to get out your ideas. It's an important opportunity to get out your ideas. And secondly, it's an opportunity to count your forces. Why you want to count your forces? Because you understand that there will be a time when you will have to take power. You will have to use armed struggle to take power. Elections can give you a good idea where your strengths are, who's supporting you, where they're supporting you, and so on. So the overall lesson of the experience was that elections were a means to an end, not an end in themselves. Let me say that again. Elections are a mean to an end, not an end in themselves. They are means for being able to mobilize, to build, and to carry out a revolutionary project. Those were the kernels of wisdom in that 11-page document. And I argue those kernels of wisdom in that 11-page document became the playbook for Lenin from between 1905 and 1917. That's if there's anything original in my book, that's the most original thing I think in my book. It is that I claim to have connected the dots between what Marx and Engels, those kernels of wisdom from Marx and Engels, and to what Lenin did between 1905 and 1917. So that's in a very highly distilled way,
right,
what the book and what the project is about.
It seems like you made those connections in a really convincing way to me. It's really well documented. I love the appendixes in the book. I think I got the version that's both volumes combined, the paperback, and it has that rich appendix where you can see the primary documents. And I thought that was so cool in terms of somebody that's engaged in popular education and propaganda, poster making, pamphlet making, even thinking of like to see what they were doing is just, again, that really rich experience. People have been doing this stuff and they've done it successfully. And it's so great to see the primary documents.
Yeah, no, that was a conscious decision because there are too many people who interpret Lenin. And my aim in the book was to make sure that people read Lenin in his own words, not through the lens of others.
Right.
And that was a conscious political decision on my part.
I found myself, I started calling myself a communist probably in my early 20s. And I still find myself really unthawing from the anti-communism that I was raised in, just by being raised in the United States. And of
We
course,
all were. Yeah.
Exactly. And one of those myths is that somehow communists and communism is anti-democratic, and not even just in the electoral sense, but the small d, respecting people's autonomy and participation. And the opposite, that couldn't be farther from the truth. The opposite is very true, that, these people are very concerned with democracy all the way through, and both have a really intentional strategy for the electoral arena, but really don't leave democracy there, take democracy further. So just seeing Lenin in his own words and Marx and Engles and to get into the material more is really helpful to come out of that fog,
No, I appreciate that. Again, that was a conscious political decision. This book is an extension of my first book called Marx and Engles, Their Contribution to the Democratic Breakthrough.
Wow.
So it's in that first book where I'm challenging and making the case that no two people contributed more to the democratic breakthrough in the 19th century than Marx and Engles. That's the central argument of the first book. And so at the end of that first book, I said, okay, so what happened to their project? Once it's in the hands of others, what happens to their project? And so I know I had to deal with the Lenin question, because I think no one has been more slandered than Lenin, in my opinion. I say that because the problem that Lenin faces is that not only his enemies, but many of his so-called friends, many of the friends of Lenin, distort Lenin's record. And so that's the problem so I was on a mission to rescue Brother Lenin, to bring him back into the world that he deserves.
Yeah, I think he's probably appreciating it somewhere. Growing up in America, you think he's like a monster or something, and I'm well past that. But I'm really appreciate learning more about him and his work. I want to talk then about, in contrast to Lenin, who was one of the people who picked up the mantle of Marx and Engels and carried it forward. You're talking about 1848, the European Spring. Lenin was operating in the early 1900s, not the 1905 revolution, the 1917, and there was others throughout Europe who carried that flame or carried that mantle and claimed to be purporting themselves as socialists or communists and engaging in the electoral arena. You talk about the self-criticism that Marx and Engels did that led them to the principles of independent working class political action, and the recognition that if you're talking about revolutionary struggle, you can't vote your way into revolution. You're going to have to mobilize and through an armed struggle win power, and elections can help you get there. There were others who took a different view, and you talk about a split that developed kind of between the social democrats and the communists, or, another word I've heard often, but I understand it more after reading your book, revisionists, people who are in the new German parliamentary state. Can you talk about that split? What is a parliamentary cretinism, and how are people displaying that parliamentary cretinism, and what criticism did Marx and Engels and Lenin have of parliamentary cretinism?
Yeah, Marx and Engels were activists in the German Revolution, the German edition of the 1848 revolution. They were activists on the barricades, actively involved in it. And so one of the issues they had to deal with was how should the working class respond to the openings, the liberal democratic openings that came into existence as a result of the masses going into the streets. And the liberals, those who wanted to institute liberal democracy, but were not interested in making sure that the liberal democratic revolution would become a socialist revolution. Sometimes Marx and Engles use, this is when they first used this term called permanent revolution. That is the fight for liberal democracy was step one in the process for real democracy. That is for human emancipation, the sovereignty of the people. It was an important development. That is, the fight for liberal democracy was crucial, but it wasn't the end of the process. And there were those who wanted to make sure that it didn't go any further than that. And that tended to be the liberals. And the liberals focused on what developments within the parliamentary arena. Their assumption was that elections to and participation in the parliamentary arena was the end all and be all of politics. If you were able to do that, that's it. And Marx and Engles came up with this term called parliamentary cretinism. And it's the mistaken belief that what takes place in the parliamentary arena is the be all and the end all of politics. Their argument was, no, it's what takes place outside. It's what takes place outside the parliamentary arena, in the streets, on the barricades, on the picket lines, on the battlefield. That's where politics, real politics, takes place. So yes, they came up with this term. It may not be the most politically correct term, parliamentary cretinism, but it's trying to get at this idea that politics begins with and ends with what takes place in the parliamentary arena.
I think it was really helpful to hear that word define that behavior and that mistaken belief, because it's a mistaken belief that is so prevalent today.
It is.
And
it is. I don't want to preempt, but you raised something very early, and I'm always interested in making sure that we connect with the present.
Please.
And thinking about the George Floyd protests and what happened here, I think the biggest problem I have with the defund the police perspective is that it dragged us back into the parliamentary arena.
Yes.
The mass movement that had been in the streets, I don't impugn the motives of the people who came up with this. Some of them I personally know. Some of them I personally know.
Definitely.
But the outcome, the objective outcome, was that it directed our attention from the streets into the legislative arena, with all the problems with the legislative arena. And we see that now. We see between the courts and the city council and all of this. Yeah, and so it demobilized the mass movement. This is what objectively it did.
I felt sick to my stomach at Powderhorn Park when I was there. And again, I'm saying this from comradely, humble critique, because there was also, I think, there was an active defund movement in the Twin Cities ever since 2015 that was mobilizing and building momentum and building consciousness. And that's one that I think was a tributary to the uprising. But when the city council took hold of the issue and the issue became the charter amendment,
exactly,
I felt sick. And a lot of people have named that, and it's important for us to understand how that dynamic has carried with us today. So I want people to think about this when we're now looking at what has become the debate over this charter amendment, and it could open up some creative public political space. So, I'm not saying don't engage with it. Again, what can we learn from Lenin and from Marx and people who were serious about revolutionary power? But what I've noticed is you had all these young people who, again, won't be able to vote on the ballot because they're under 18 or they're on supervised. We do not have universal suffrage in this country right now. A lot of people who don't have papers, who risk their life and limb in the streets, who created the political space for the amendment, and now their commitments are being watered down, their asks are being watered down, and they're not able to participate. So it's important for us to recognize that and not be deluded by parliamentary cretinism to think that that's where we're going to beat the police or we're going to change things, and it's in the streets. So again, thank you for bringing that perspective.
And to go back to your question about the split that took place in the left. In many ways, this was exactly around this question. There were those in the socialist movement who thought that you could bring about socialism through the parliamentary process. Through the parliamentary process, sometimes became known as the parliamentary road to socialism. And so if you're looking at the origins of that split, it was around this question of whether or not could a socialist revolution be made through the parliamentary road. And you asked a question in the things you sent to me about the Paris Commune.
Yeah.
And the Paris Commune is extremely important, extremely important.
Could we talk about that a bit?
It's the only time, because of the Paris Commune, it's the only time that Marx and Engles thought that they needed to make a correction in the Communist Manifesto based upon the experience of the Paris Commune. Okay, the Paris Commune was an uprising, a mass uprising of the Parisian proletariat in March of 1871. And this uprising was a product, it came out of a war. France lost a war between Germany and France in 1870. And the masses in Paris decided, no, they needed to have a government that really represented the interests of the working class. And so they rose up. And in rising up, they instituted a government or another Republican government, but they realized that the government they instituted could not serve the interests of the working class. It was incapable of serving the interests of the working class. And because of that fact on the ground, they had to come up with a new form of government, and it was called the Paris Commune. And the Paris Commune was the most radical democratic form of government to have ever appeared until that moment. And it involved elections at the local level, not only geographical elections in Paris, but elections in the workplace. Imagine having elections in the workplace for the first time, where you elect the representatives to the legislature from your workplace, and you could immediately recall them. You could immediately recall your representatives.
Wow.
So that was the commune. And so the chief lesson for Marx and Engles, and this goes to your question about the split, the lesson Marx and Engles said, and Marx used to always like to say this, is something that the working class learned on its own, not through some book, but the working class learned on its own that it could not utilize the bourgeois state. It could not utilize the capitalist state to carry out socialist transformation. That is, to carry out a transformation to serve the interests of the working class. The working class had to invent a new kind of governance. The old form of governance, the parliamentary system, was inadequate. It was an obstacle. It was an obstacle for socialist transformation. So therein is the fundamental split that manifests itself later in 1914. But those people who call themselves socialists, who think that you can make use of the bourgeois state to carry out socialist transformation, and those of us who say, no, you cannot use the bourgeois state, you will have to come up with a new kind of state along the lines of the Paris Commune, and later what the Soviets did, what happened in the Russian Revolution. So that's the fundamental difference. And you can see this, you saw this with the Bernie Sanders campaign. I remember watching Sanders at one of his rallies, the one in New York on Long Island, in which he said it very explicitly, we are going to make an election through the electoral process. He made it very clear. That is, in other words, what Sanders represents are those forces who believe, contrary to what the commune demonstrated, who believe that you can use the bourgeois state, you can use the capitalist state to carry out socialist transformation.
I was just listening to someone reflect on the fact that one of the small concessions that Biden, gave, or was an increase in, I think it was Social Security benefits in this new, and the department of the government that's supposed to do it. You know what I'm saying? And they were hoping like, oh, if it happens by 2022 or 2024, then that's like a boost for Biden. Even this really modest increase in benefits, the department came back and said we wouldn't even be able to do it till like 2025 or 26. In the same report, we looked at the inability to, Flint, Michigan hasn't had clean water in how many years? And it's not just Flint, Michigan. It's the infrastructure in poor and black neighborhoods across this whole country. So I think that's, another demonstration, a learn through experience that like it can't even provide what the modest means now,
And that's what the Parisian proletariat discovered on its own. There was no book in which this was in, but on their own, they realized that the government that was in place, the political system that was in place, the parliamentary system that was in place was inadequate. It was an obstacle for actually carrying out real social reform. And so they realized they had to come up with a new form of state. And that was the lesson of the Paris Commune. And that was the lesson that was deeply, deeply attractive to Lenin. And Lenin understood that better than anyone, the importance of the commune. And so when there was a form, and you asked this question earlier about who were the Soviets. Well, the Soviets were basically councils. They began as strike committees to coordinate the strikes in the different factories in the 1905 revolution. You had to coordinate them. And so you had to have these councils to be able to coordinate the strike activities in St. Petersburg. And that's basically what the Soviets were. They began organs to organize, to make decisions, therefore, that representatives from the various factories got elected to. They were elected to the Soviets and so on in order to coordinate strike activity. That's basically, Soviet means councils.
That's another thing that like was a real eye opener for me is that I've heard the word Soviet Union my whole life. And I was in my 20s when I even got an idea of what a Soviet means. What is that, And I think it's also important to tie things back to today for I know a lot of our listeners and a lot of working people who maybe didn't even consider themselves political not long ago have experience in something like a Soviet, maybe not to that degree, but so much happened in our communities in the last year. People providing ambulance services, people providing safety when the police would not, people coordinating serious political action, direct actions, and have experience in that type of collective decision-making body. And then to recognize that that's an incredible expression of democracy. That's real democracy. That's us taking power and affecting the conditions of our lives. So again, I think for all of us listening to like really let go of the anti-communism and that we've been that has been beat into us, and understand
we have to admit that all kinds of things have been done in the name of communism.
Facts.
We have to admit that. There's a history. We can't deny, just like all kinds of things are done in the name of Christianity.
Amen.
Or in the name of Islam, all kinds of things have been done in the name of communism. And we have to come to grips with that.
Yes.
And we have to be able to prepare to answer that and discuss that. What was and what was not real.
Right. And again, like that's why reading this real history and actually understanding that like, Soviet isn't some Russian word for like terror. It's like, no, that's a history, that's a thing. It's a council. It's an attempt, right? So let's get into Lenin more then. You talk about, he was in the camp that did not think you could use the bourgeois state for the type of social transformation that would better the lives of poor and working people. But that doesn't mean he didn't participate in elections. So, can you just give us a sense of like, what was the Duma? How did the Russian people win a Duma? And then what was Lenin's general like objective? What use did he see in the Duma?
Yes, the Duma was Russia's parliamentary system that was granted under duress by the regime, because the masses took to the streets in 1905. They took to the streets in 1905, and the regime, just as regimes historically had done, they felt under threat, and therefore they felt they needed to make some concessions. And making concessions mean, okay, you can vote now, you can have a legislative system and so on. And so under duress, the regime in Russia granted Dumas, the first parliamentary systems to appear in Russia. And so there were 4 different Dumas, 4 different legislative sessions. The first one in 1906, That was overthrown. Well, the regime, the Tsar didn't like it because it was too progressive for his taste. There was a second Duma later that year, and that was also ended by the regime. And so for the third Duma, they made it more difficult to have elections and so on, to make it more difficult for working people to have elections. And then there was a fourth Duma in 1912. And in all four of those Dumas, Lenin actively made sure that there would be representatives from the working class, from the party. He belonged to officially called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and the wing of that he belonged to, known as the Bolsheviks. He was always active in making sure, however limited the political space, however limited the democratic rights were, to make sure that they would get people elected into those Dumas in order to use that space to do political work, to advertise, to educate, and to count their forces. And so Lenin in 1920, in a very famous book he wrote called Infantile Communism, left-wing communism, and infantile disorder. And it's a debate with people on the left in Europe. And some of the people on the left in Europe were saying, look, we don't need to participate in these parliamentary arenas. They're a waste of time. There's nothing to be gained. And Lenin objected. He said, look, we participated in the most wretched kinds of parliaments called the Dumas and so on. But that work was indispensable. That's the term he used. That work was indispensable in understanding why the Bolsheviks were able to come to power in 1917. That decade-long work, you're using that limited space to educate, to count your forces, to organize and so on. In other words, to go back to those two kernels of wisdom in the 1850 document of Marx and Engles, which, by the way, Lenin had committed to memory. Lenin had memorized that document, and that's why it's Lenin's playbook in 1970. So yes, as long as it was clear, no, we understand that elections and parliaments cannot make a revolution, but they can be used, they can be utilized. They can be utilized to educate and to count your forces and to determine when, what day, when, at what moment. And one of the most important things they were able to do with the Duma elections, but also with the Soviets, most importantly with the Soviets. And that's the big issue within 1970. There are two competing, it's a little complex, but basically there are two forms of representative democracy that emerged in 1917. You had the parliamentary form called the Dumas, but you had the Soviets. And these Soviets are the most democratic ones. They're in the workplace. And also you got Soviets within the military. Imagine that. Imagine that you got Soviets in the military.
That was one of the most standout pieces of the history to me, is how it was, they were called the Soviets of the workers, deputies, and the military soldiers, and the conditions of oppression that existed in the military and the organizing. It's just incredible. And so for listeners to get this history, is like those two representative bodies, those two options appeared in the moment when the Tsar was forced to abdicate the throne, right?
Exactly.
So they were still living under monarchy, totalitarian autocracy.
Right.
And there was a street movement that forced the Tsar to step down completely. And then you had this more liberal representative, something that would kind of be compared to like any of a liberal representative parliament,
exactly.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
But they had this tradition of Soviets in Russia that through the movement had been organizing, coordinating strikes. And what I learned, I had heard the term dual power for many years as an organizer, but never knew that the origin of that term dual power came from that moment.
Yeah.
When you had the Soviets exercising power after the Tsar stepped down, and the constituent, or not the Constituent Assembly, but the legislative body.
Right, the Dumas.
The Dumas, yes.
The Dumas versus the Soviets. Yes, that's the most contentious issue in 1917. Which form of representative democracy would be dominant, hegemonic? Would it be the parliamentary Duma form, or would it be the Soviet form? That's the debate. That's the fundamental debate in 1917. And Lenin, of course, prioritized the Soviets, and the Soviets were much more representative of the population. This is where the masses, the working class, had its greatest influence. And I can't stress enough the idea of having Soviets in the military, because this is an opportunity to do political work inside the military. There will come a time in a real revolutionary situation in the United States where the most important thing we will have to do is to win over the military. And remember, the military are just workers in uniform. They're from the working class. That's who's in the military. I'm not talking about the police, but the military.
I hear you, and honestly, a lot of us went through the first experience we've had in our lives of a occupation of a sort,
Of course.
We were active during the curfew in a lot of different ways. And there was a distinction being made in the field at the time between the police and the military. And that's not to paint over the right-wing elements in the military,
Sure.
but I've seen a lot of these questions start to rise to the surface again, or people start to recognize that reality. I don't want to get too deep into it, but I was really struck by my experience getting vaccinated, because it was, I think, an Air Force unit, perhaps, that was from out of town that was running the site at the state fairground. Mm-hmm. And it was young Black and brown folks, from Texas. I got treated exceptionally well. It was in a moment of real political contention in the city, and I felt safe and comfortable there, and I felt encouraged because I was seeing my contemporaries, and people I feel like I could have real conversations with. So I just wanted to say that made me think of that, and that moment has really stuck with me this year, and I reflect on that experience because I've never had a positive interaction with the state before. I've been arrested before.
Sure.
And
that's why we have to do political work to win them over. Yeah, we can't dismiss them. We want to work to win them over to the revolution. That's what the Bolsheviks were able to do. And so that's why when the Bolsheviks came to power in October, November of 1917, in St. Petersburg, no more than about 10 people were killed. More than about 10 people were killed. The reason why is because the majority of the population had gone over to the side of the Bolsheviks, and especially if you win the military over, you don't have to worry about people being shot and killed by the military, right? Because you won the military,
right? It's powerful. Can we talk a bit more about so how did Lenin encourage the folks who got elected to the Dumas, who did represent the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party? How did he expect them to behave? How did they make use of that space? What was revolutionary parliamentarism?
Good question. It's out of those discussions, debates around this question about how to conduct themselves at campaigns that the term that you may have heard called democratic centralism. The term democratic, it comes out of that experience. And one of the things that the Bolsheviks and Lenin recognized was that in Germany, the Social Democratic Party had the biggest party in Germany, and they had elected a lot of people to the Reichstag, which is the parliament in Germany. But the representatives of the SPD in the Reichstag increasingly over time became more and more alienated from the rank and file within the party. They began to see themselves as having their own operation inside the parliament, inside the Reichstag. And as a result, by the end of the 20th century, in 19th century, the Reichstag, the parliamentary fraction of the party, had become a different operation. It was no longer, it didn't see itself under the discipline of the rank and file within the party. And it was because of that Lenin felt, and others felt, that in order to avoid that problem, in order to head that off, it was important to have members of the parliament be subordinate to carry out the decisions of the party. And the general term that is used to refer to that is called democratic centralism. Democratic centralism. It's more complicated than that, but that's the brief explanation that was employed to discipline, to make sure that just because you're in parliament now doesn't mean that you are a free operator, a free ranger. You can do your own thing now, separate and apart from the party.
Right. And I think one way it's described, I don't know if this is your term or something that floats around, but now it's slipping my mind. What is it like? Internal debate, but unity of action. Like, democratic centralism. Now the phrase is slipping my mind. I just had it.
Well, basically, let me just say, democratic centralism is, as Lenin explained on many occasions, means that when it comes to decision making in the party, full democracy, everybody has the right to participate in the decisions. Everybody. Once a decision is made by the majority, however, everybody is obligated to carry out the decision of the majority. That's the centralism.
Right.
But in order for the centralism to really work, you have to have democracy. And that is, you have to believe that, okay, I'm willing to go along with the majority decision. I don't agree with it, but I will go along with it knowing that there will be, in another period, within the next year, 3 months or whatever, there will be another opportunity for there to be a debate to take place in which we will make a decision, in which we will make a decision about how to proceed. And my ability to convince others of my opinion is having been loyal to the decision of the majority, that a decision I didn't agree with. Right. But I loyally carried out that decision. Right. I loyally carried out that decision. I didn't agree with it because I knew I would have an opportunity to change opinions. Another opportunity for there to be a democratic debate and discussion.
And you talk about the way that they were really unparalleled in political parties in Russia for that democratic process. You know, they went to leaps and bounds to make sure that they discussed the issue, and it fostered a really, I want that in my life, is that really rich critical discussion where people really argue it out. That's so healthy and good, you know. And you were saying these are people who are exiled. These are, you know, in the context of
they risk their lives going to meetings.
Yes.
Because they couldn't hold the meetings inside Russia, so they had to have the meetings in exile. Well, there were police informers. There were police informers in the organization. That's the way it is in all. That's the history of political organizing and so on. And so people would get arrested trying to come back into the country from a meeting and so on. And so they had to write the minutes in such a way. If you're going to have real democratic decision making, you got to have minutes. You got to have a record of what actually happened. Well, that risks revealing somebody's name and so on. Yeah. So you got to figure out then how to have a democratic discussion, how to take a vote under conditions in which it's possible that you got police informers inside the organization. And so, yes, they more than any other party, and I may be wrong, and I've looked into this to some extent, and I've known of no other party that went to such great lengths at risk to life and limb to having democratic debate and discussion and decision making, as was the case with the Bolsheviks.
Yeah. Another piece I wanted to make sure I touch on is something, again, that comes up today and was coming up 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, is this lesser evil conundrum, you know? So, you know, we're told we have to vote for Biden, otherwise Trump will get in, you know what I'm saying? Or you're told you have to vote for this candidate because if you don't, then you're splitting the vote and the bad guy's going to get in, the fascist perhaps. I learned that this is a debate that's happened in other contexts and what's happening in Russia. What did Marx and Engles and what did Lenin have to say about that?
Yeah, it's in that little 11-page document, the address. Yeah, Marx and Engles addresses this very question. About the lesser of the two evils, of splitting the vote, and Marx and Engels, their basic argument was that the advantages of having independent working class political action outweigh outweigh the disadvantages of having reactionaries, some reactionaries getting elected. The advantages outweigh the disadvantages of having reactionaries elected. All right, Marx and Engles didn't get a chance to have a second set of elections to go through this, but the Bolsheviks did. So it's Lenin who goes into great detail on the lesser evil question, because you had what was an almost not quite fascist movement in Russia known as the Black Hundreds. And the liberals kept telling the Bolsheviks, look, if you all keep running these candidates, these fascist-like elements are going to be able to get elected. So
and the Black Hundreds are doing violence against people in the streets and engaging in all sorts of
pogroms against Jewish people in Russia and so on. Yeah, they're the predecessors, the forerunners to the fascists in Europe. Mm-hmm. And so, well, Lenin disagreed with the argument, but he had to prove it, and he said, look, and Lenin, one of the most remarkable things about Lenin was to learn how much he pored over statistics. He loved statistics and analyzing voting rolls in elections and so on.
It made me realize, like, bro, you can't ignore those numbers. You have no excuse, you know. Like,
he loved going through it, and he poured through the data and to show that in those first elections that no, we would not be splitting the vote, and that and indeed he was proven right. That indeed, based upon previous election returns, he was able to analyze and to challenge that argument. But he also understood in the final analysis, reactionary elements will not be defeated in elections. They're going to be defeated in the streets. That's where reactionary elements are going to be defeated, in the street, out mobilizing them in the streets.
And he even addresses, the point that to give people the false perception that you can vote out fascists is actually veiling the true nature of the fascist threat. You might ring a panicked alarm, but people who are taking that threat seriously know that the danger is in the streets, and you could outvote them and still be in danger, and you're going to have to confront them. So I found that really clarifying in the book. We're creeping up on the hour mark.
And, was there anything that you wanted, any real urgent question? There was one thing I wanted to stress from the book that I think is original.
I'd love to hear it. But
it's based upon the notion of parliamentary cretinism, and also based upon some comments that Lenin wrote after the revolution in reply to some of the critics about elections. And I've coined a term, and I think it's original, I've never seen it anywhere before, called voting fetishism. Voting fetishism, I argue, is the mistaken belief that when you vote, you're exercising political power. Voting fetishism, I argue, is the mistaken belief that when you vote, you're exercising political power. No. I argue that when you vote, you're exercising an important democratic right to register a preference for either a candidate or a particular policy. You're not exercising political power. Political power means to impose your will. If you think about when you vote, it takes maybe 30 seconds to vote, and you're doing it as an individual. Nothing is far further from the reality of power. Anything that takes 30 seconds and is done alone. To exercise political power takes a long time and a lot of people. And so what I'm trying to do is to drawing upon the ideas of Marx and Engles that voting is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And to think that you're exercising political power when you're voting can be very, very dangerous. It can be very dangerous. And that real power takes place in the streets, on the picket lines, on the barricades, in the battlefield. That's what history has proven. So if there's anything original in the book, It's this notion of voting fetishism. That's a term I've coined, and I'm drawing on Marx and Engles and Lenin with that particular term, and trying to disabuse people of the notion that somehow when we're voting, we're exercising political power. Again, it's an important democratic right. It's an important democratic right, but we're registering a preference. Registering a preference is not exercising political power. Power means to impose your will. To impose your will.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I really appreciate that insight, and I really appreciate the hard work that went into this book. Like it was such a gift for me, and I've really appreciated the discussion. You know, I could talk for another hour, and, you know, maybe we'll have you back on sometime, but I've really enjoyed it. I think this will be really useful reflection material for people who are engaging in these elections now and preparing to engage beyond these elections in the projects like you're talking about, building real political power on the ground. So I want to extend my thanks and my gratitude to you for coming on the show.
No, I appreciate this and learning about your podcast. And so send me the link and I'll share it with my students.
Awesome. Can I ask you one more question?
Yeah.
Could you tell us how Thelonious Monk saved you from the imperialist project?
All right, well, okay. All right. Briefly, I had graduated in international relations from Purdue, and so, like a lot of young people, I'm trying to find a job. Yeah. And so the Foreign Service. And so I tried to take the test, failed the test, and but I was going to try again. And then I learned about this program. The State Department was trying to find young Black people to serve, to be the face of Washington imperialism in Africa.
And I noticed the Ford Foundation was involved.
Oh, yeah. They gave over the money.
Exactly. They still do.
So I was in D.C. at Howard University. Yeah, there was going to be an interview, a Saturday morning interview at 8 o'clock in the morning, not my time of the day as it is, to do the interview, to see whether or not I could get into the program. Well, my man had been in town. Thelonious Monk. And I had just gotten my tax return check, and he was playing at a famous club in D.C. called the Bohemian Caverns.
Okay.
And I went 4 nights in a row to hear Monk and sipping my favorite at that time, Wild Turkey.
Yeah.
Canadian rye. And so 4 nights in a row. So by the time of Saturday morning, I was in no shape. Seemed like I knew anything other than Monk. So I spectacularly bummed the interview. So, and for that reason, I say I was saved. I was saved from the imperialist project by Monk.
Hey, and so definitely Monk was doing his work. It definitely, you know, not only your enjoyment, but it provided us a lot of light for years to come. So that's beautiful. Right, thanks for sharing that story. And thanks so much for joining us.
Okay, Jake. Good knowing you.
Right on. Money, power, land, solidarity.